Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. Now, today we're going to cover a bit of a broad subject, and it's kind of my opinion on the Hollywood remake, and what good remakes have been, what bad remakes have been, and kind of what makes up each one of those. So we're going to go, and first thing I want to explain is, though, there's a difference between a remake and a reboot. Now, a reboot is generally to reboot a franchise. So if you look at the Spider-Man films, for instance, the Amazing Spider-Man after Spider-Man 2, it only came 5 years after, was a relatively short amount of time, in movie-wise, short amount of time, where you had a film that was restarting the franchise or a quote-unquote reboot. And I would consider Spider-Man Homecoming to be another one in that line. Again, that's the most recent one that we're able to see. Another one, again, superhero movies, is the MCU Incredible Hulk film versus the Eric Bana Hulk from, I believe it was 2003. So, there's a difference. A remake is generally a film that's done many years after the original was done, so that you have a new audience to present the material to. And generally, it's also the story is changed or altered, but it's generally the same type of story. So, first things first, we're going to go into examples of good and bad remakes. Now, a good remake would be something like David Cronenberg's The Fly, or John Carpenter's The Thing, or I can't remember the director's name off the top of my head, but The Blob from 1988. Again, they do seem to revolve a little bit around horror films, but I think that's kind of it's a good genre where remakes tend to work well. Bad remakes would include things like The Day the Earth Stood Still with Keanu Reeves, Total Recall with Colin Farrell, and I'm trying to think, but they've been doing it a lot with, especially with 80s movies. Now they want to remake Masters of the Universe, which actually that was early 90s, but you have a lot of bad remakes, a lot of remakes that shouldn't really be talked about or done. The Death Wish remake recently with Bruce Willis, and many others. So let's go over kind of what qualifies for Hollywood doing a remake. What should be remade versus things that probably shouldn't. So if you're going to remake a film, you should probably make sure that film is not iconic to the level where you're going to have issues with audiences confusing it. Like, you shouldn't remake Casablanca. You shouldn't remake Gone with the Wind. Stuff like that. You shouldn't remake those movies, because those movies, you could never remake them the way that they were. In the case of Casablanca, it's actually a period piece from the year it was made, which I believe was 1941 or 42. So it would be hard to make that movie today, given the way that it was presented back then. So that's a difficulty. And again, you have an issue with Gone with the Wind, where Gone with the Wind is such an iconic film, and everybody knows about it. Maybe less the younger generation, but I think everybody who, I would say maybe 30 and older, would probably, if you said Gone with the Wind, they'd at least know what you were talking about, even if they don't know the story, or they haven't seen the film. They'll at least know of it. So I think you have to start with films that I wouldn't say aren't well known, but maybe films that you think could translate well to a current day adaptation. And I think that was done well with The Thing, where it was actually more of a basis of source material. So the original The Thing, or what it was titled was The Thing from Another World, was made in 1951, and it's a film that I personally enjoy, because I like old monster movies, but it's a very dry film in terms of, like, it's humorous for somebody to watch today, because it's basically about a salaryman that drinks human blood, as opposed to the John Carpenter version from 1982, which took the original source material more seriously, and took the idea of an alien that could mimic other life forms, and the paranoia and all that of not knowing who's a thing and who's not a thing. The amazing score by Ennio Morricone, and many other things in that movie that make it amazing. And it's unfortunate that it did flop at the box office, and that it was criticized a lot for the blood and gore factor, even though that is an amazing part of the movie, and especially the practical effects. So, and the Blob same can be said for the Fly and the Blob as well. Where the Fly didn't necessarily take different things from the source material, but it did. It warped the source material into something that was a bit more modern, where you had a gene splicing storyline as opposed to just exchanging of body parts. And it made it a lot more horrific to see what was happening to Jeff Goldblum's body in that movie while he's playing the character of Seth Brundle. But again, a good remake kind of takes the idea of the original and twists it to the point where it's original again, but you still can recognize it as being a product from that original film, if that makes sense. And again, I just gave the examples of the Fly and the Thing. It's the same kind of idea of you have this base point. So the Fly is about a mad scientist, well, not a mad scientist, but a scientist who creates a teleporter to bring him from point A to point B, and there's an accident with the teleporter, and somehow something happens with him and a fly. The basic plot line is the same, however, the execution is completely different. The Thing is a similar. Again, it does the same thing, where you have an alien spaceship that lands in the Antarctic, gets dug up, alien life form gets brought back to this research base, and then proceeds to wreak havoc. Same basic idea, very different execution. And I think that's what you need to look for in a remake, is you need to look for a different execution. Because if you are making a shot-by-shot remake, that remake should not be made. Because the movie has already been made before, you don't need to make it again. And I think that's the general problem with shot-by-shot remakes. Like Psycho did that as well, with a shot-by-shot remake with starring Vince Vaughn, where it was why did somebody make this? And I think actually, if I remember correctly, the director of that movie said that he remade Psycho simply so nobody else could remake Psycho, which is again is a terrible reason to remake a movie. But that's the issue. The other issue is trying to spin a story and put in social issues. So let's go to the bad side of this. Let's go to let's go to some of the bad remakes. Let's go to The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, the original Day the Earth Stood Still was made in 1951, and that movie was about a space alien who lands on Earth and tries to talk with the world governments. They will not cooperate with him because of the Cold War and because of national tensions. So he basically escapes the custody of the U.S. government and proceeds to gather a group of individuals in order to project his message, which is that if nuclear power gets out of control, then the Earth will be destroyed by other civilizations so that they don't harm others. And in the new one, it's basically aliens are pissed that people are destroying the Earth environmentally. So they send down Keanu Reeves and a CGI robot Gork to destroy the planet, and Gork turns into a swarm of locusts, and it's very, very stupid. So that's one of those things. Is like, look, that movie, the original movie, had a message, it had a point. It was poignant at the time because it was made in 1951, not long after the nuclear bomb was developed for Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, and it had poignancy. It was 1951. We were in the middle of the Cold War. I believe the Russians had just tested their first nuclear bombs not long before that, and it was very, very poignant, as opposed to today, which I shouldn't say today, because I believe that movie was made in 2008. But in 2008, you're in a movie theater trying to watch a good sci-fi movie, and they're beating you over the head with an environmental message. And that's a problem that a lot of movies actually around that time had. Day After Tomorrow had a similar issue, even though that movie was based around specifically natural disasters. But to digress, that's the problem, is that you need some form of originality in the execution. And if you don't have originality in the execution, then you can't make a good remake. And that is what Hollywood doesn't really get about remakes so much, is that they want to do it the lazy way. They want to do this. So let me just go through the what I believe to be the reasoning behind doing a remake at all. So you have an original film. That original film, whether it's popular or not, it gets made, it gets put out, and then you just sort of, you move on from that. Now let's fast forward 20, 30 years later. Studio looks in and says, all right, well, we need to put a movie out in this genre, but somebody suggests, okay, why don't we remake this older film that people really liked, and we'll remake it and we'll make it for a new generation. And that's the idea of a remake, is the idea that you're taking an older film that the current generation may or may not know about, and you are making it into a new movie designed for a newer generation. Now, that can be taken one of two ways. That can be taken it can be taken as you are making a new movie for a new generation, so you're going to shoehorn in all these modern issues, and you're going to shoehorn in all this stuff about modern culture and all that bullshit, and that usually winds up making you a big fat goose egg at the box office. Whereas if you go about it in a different way, if you say, we want to make an entertaining, we want to make a different version of this movie and put it out to the public and see what they want to see, and maybe the people of this generation will respond to it better, or ideally better than how they responded to the original. Even if the original was successful, they want the remake to be more successful. Then that's how you should approach it from a mental standpoint. But most of the time, what we see is very, very poor writing jobs with these films, where a lot of social issues are shoehorned in, and then the film is made, and basically everybody comes out and says, okay, the original was better. Very rarely do they say the remake is better than the original in any sense of that word. Again, except for some of the exceptions that I've listed. But you go into that and you say, okay, so they make this movie, but the other thing that they've started to do is, this is especially more pertinent nowadays, especially with films from the 80s and the 70s, is they want to bank on nostalgia. They want to say, oh, well, maybe if we put this out now, we can snag in those other people that maybe their parents know about it or they've heard about it, but maybe they haven't seen it. And I could say that with the Bruce Willis Death Wish film, even though that film is very, very different from the original Death Wish with Charles Bronson. And I say that saying that the original Death Wish from the 70s with Charles Bronson is one of my favorite films ever, and it's a great movie about it's basically a character study of a man who's received extreme trauma in his life and turns to violent means in order to cope with that. And this is from somebody who in the movie is depicted as being a pacifist who was a conscientious objector during the Korean War. And it's very complex as a character study, as opposed to the later films, which are done by the Cannon Group, that are basically just mindless action movies. The original is very different, and I believe it was also written by the person who wrote Dial M for Murder for Hitchcock. But to go back, the Bruce Willis Death Wish film is a lot like the sequels in the sense that it is basically a mindless action movie, and it doesn't capture what the original had. And the reason why the original was so good is because it had the character study in it. It had all the little workings. It wasn't just a soulless Hollywood product, which is what a lot of these remakes turn out to be, is soulless. And I say that in the sense that this thing was written by somebody who didn't give a crap. This movie was it's a movie that's written by someone that doesn't care, directed by somebody that doesn't care, acted by actors who are just there for a paycheck, and then they put it out and they do that. But it's not ideal. It's not what you want to see for entertainment. And the second part about it is like, look, and everybody says this, and I don't know why studios don't listen to it more, is that we've seen the story before, and in many cases we've seen it done better. So why are you putting it in front of us again and expecting us to consume it? And I think the idea behind that is that it's easier for them because they know that story worked once before, and they're trying to put it out again to see if it can work again. But here's the thing: Every single Hollywood studio has a backlog of spec scripts. Now, most of them are shit. Most of them are complete crap. But they have a backlog of spec scripts that they keep in a warehouse somewhere or in a storage area in the studio. Actual physical paper copies. I'm not sure how much they have in digital, if they even keep half of them. But they do have a lot of paper copies of old scripts that they have received over time. And you can't tell me, and I don't know if producers have come out and said that we prefer to produce other things as opposed to taking chances on original content, but it's pretty self-evident that that's what they think of, is that they don't want to take chances on original content, despite the fact they have warehouses that are full of it, and they have underpaid interns that they could have sift through every single one of those damn screenplays and see if any one of them is even worth the merit, which I guarantee you there are at least a few that are, because I'm not talking about 10, 20 screenplays. These warehouses probably have hundreds of thousands of spec scripts that have been submitted to the studio by various people and various writers over time. And that's not even to mention the stuff that's probably copywritten through the writers guilds, both east and west. So I mean, there's a lot of material out there that they could try and pull from, but they choose not to. In many cases, because they do not want to take a chance on something that they don't 100% know would make money. And here's the thing: is a remake, even though it might bomb, they believe has a better chance of making money than something that's original. And that's why we see these endless amounts of sequels. That's why we see these reboots, 5 years after the old series ends, they're rebooting it again, and they're already talking about rebooting it. Or they're remaking films that were made, 20 years ago. They're remaking films like, Total Recall. That was, I think, when the remake came out, that film might have only been 23 years old. And a bunch of other movies back from the 80s they've been trying to remake or make sequels to. Obviously Star Wars, they've been making sequels to that. There's been talk of remaking Back to the Future, which thank God Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis have shot that down. But there's a ton of stuff. Indiana Jones, talk of a new installment of that, which I think is actually in development right now, or rebooting it. Or if you want to call it rebooting it, I'd say it's a remake at this point. But remaking that series, and a bunch of other stuff, and it gets to the point where you're thinking to yourself, what am I going? My DVD collection has all of the movies that are going to come out this year. You can sit there and you can look at movies from the 80s and you can say, okay, that's coming out, that's coming out, that's coming out. And it's ridiculous, to be frank. It's completely ridiculous with the way that they tend to do it. And albeit now they're starting to take more chances on stuff. They're starting to dive a bit more into other genres, video games and anime and stuff like that, as opposed to just pulling from their old film catalogs. But it's still concerning. It's still very concerning because Hollywood, again, there wasn't any Star Wars before Star Wars. Before 1977, there was not Star Wars. Star Wars did not exist at all. And then after 1970s, and it's hard for certain people to imagine a world where for me, obviously Star Wars, for me, Star Wars was made, 15 years before I was born. So, a world without Star Wars to me is not something that makes sense, because it's always existed for me. But there are times when those movies didn't exist, and it took people like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Ridley Scott and James Cameron and a bunch of other directors to come along and think these ideas up and write them down on paper and write scripts and make movies so that we had these things. And when we're children, when we're adults, and we had these things that were entertaining and we loved. And I don't think you have directors in Hollywood anymore, young directors for the most part. I don't think you have young directors anymore that are there to make anything new. They're puppets that get hired by producers to make things that you already know and spin it a little bit to make you pay money for it. And that's what the Hollywood remake is in reality these days, especially, is the Hollywood remake is a cash grab. It is a cheap cash grab, and all they want to do is they want to spend as little time and as little money on it as possible. They'll get a big name to star in it. They'll get a big name to direct it, and they'll hook you on that, and they'll say, oh, they'll say, oh, if you like the original, you'll love this one. It's like, no, if I like the original, I'll go watch the damn original. I don't want to watch the piece of shit you're trying to force feed me. And I'm sorry that that rant dragged on a little bit, but those are my thoughts. And I think it most of the remakes that are made today are pure soulless trash remakes for the most part. And to be honest, I think that Hollywood needs to take more chances on objective content, on content that is original, and something that you can see that is original. Not a rip off of something else. You can't do you can't pitch to me a movie called Asteroid about a giant asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, and then a bunch of people are going to go up and blow up the asteroid, and have me not thinking about Armageddon. The movie Armageddon with Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck from the late '90s. You can't pitch me a movie like that and not expect me to think of another movie that it is extremely similar to, even if the same name is not plastered on it. So again, that's just my thoughts on the issue. I'd like to know your thoughts on the issue. Any good remakes that you think that maybe I didn't mention in this? Again, those are just my personal favorites, the ones that I did mention. Hit the like button and hit the bell for notifications. And remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?